My name is Oren Brooks. I'm at the Smith-Robertson Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. I have with me today Mr. Alvin Bronstein, Attorney Alvin Bronstein. And this is a continuation of an interview that we started approximately 8 or 9 months ago. So I'm going to begin by asking Attorney Bronstein, we do have your permission for this interview?
Yes, you do.
And Al, give us a refresher in terms of who you are, a little about your background, and how you became involved with ACLU plus your Mississippi legal work.
Well, I was a lawyer in New York City in the 50s. And in the late 50s, I happened to meet James Farmer, who was then National Director of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And he heard I had a law office in Brooklyn. He said, we have a very militant CORE chapter in Brooklyn, and they need a lawyer badly. And I became general counsel to the Brooklyn CORE. And I accompanied them. I got them out of jail when they came down to join the Freedom Riders in '61. They never made it to Jackson. They got arrested up in the Delta, and I came down and got them out of jail. And then in the late spring of 1964, the ACLU and other civil rights and human rights organizations got together and organized something called the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, or LCDC, in anticipation of Freedom Summer, when they knew that there were going to be lots of activity in the Deep South states around civil rights and voter registration and other activities, with very few lawyers available to help out in the event of problems. I heard about it, and I volunteered to come down for 2 weeks and stayed for 4 years. I first went to St. Augustine, Florida briefly, where there was a lot of activity around the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. And then I came to Mississippi in the fall of '64, and we opened a full-time office here in Jackson for LCDC, and I was chief staff counsel. We had an office in New Orleans and an office in Selma as well, and I supervised all three, but lived in Jackson. I stayed here till 1968, doing civil rights legal work. Most of those years in Mississippi, representing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and doing a lot of political work. Some of the other states, it was different kinds of legal work. And I left in '68, spent a few years at Harvard, at the Kennedy School of Government, and then went back to South New Orleans for a year in '71, '72, where I ran a training program for young African-American lawyers, including one young man who is now here in Jackson, Dave Dennis, who I'm sure you know, who's no longer practicing law, but he's working in other important work. And then in '72, after the Attica disturbance, Attica uprising, the National ACLU decided to organize a national prison project to do legal work around prison conditions, and I became the director of that and continued with that until 1996, when I became a consultant to the National ACLU, which is what I do now, although I also do some international human rights work.
Now, Al, during your time here in Mississippi, you said your office was located on Fire Street.
603 North Fire Street.
And what other attorneys were involved with you during that 4-year period that you spent here in Mississippi?
Well, I had permanent staff lawyers by the names of James Lewis and Bruce Rogo, R-O-G-O-W, and Malcolm Farmer, and Michael Rosen, and William Copit, K-O-P-I-T. They were all full-time staff lawyers, but also during those 4 years, I had about 350 volunteer lawyers who came down for 2 to 4 weeks on their vacations, because at that time we were dealing with, on every Monday morning, we'd have cases in justice of the peace courts all over the state. And I'd have to send one lawyer to Poplarville, and one lawyer to Ruleville, and one lawyer to Sunflower, and one lawyer to Hattiesburg, and one, I need a lot of bodies, and that's what we use these volunteer lawyers for.
And you yourself spent some time, as I understand it, in Macomb in Pike County?
Yeah, in the fall of '64, before we opened the office and before I found a place to live in Jackson, I actually lived in the Freedom House in Macomb, Mississippi, working with the local COFO headquarters, group there, preparing for a big trial against the Highway Patrol, the county sheriffs, and the city police for failure to protect African Americans engaged in civil rights work, for interfering with their attempts to register to vote, and generally harassing them. And,
were you at all involved with the school walkout that happened in Macomb in 1961 or 62, was it?
No. I was involved. There was a school walkout in March of '65, and about 60 high school kids were arrested and locked up in the Hines County.
What brought about that demonstration?
They were voting rights,
Okay.
and they were trying to march down by the courthouse, and they were all arrested. The grown-ups were arrested too, but they shipped them all off to Hines County to separate them from the kids.
From the children? Mhm.
And I went in to
And
try
they
to,
kept the children incarcerated where?
in the Pike County Jail.
Pike
back
County?
of the-
And you
back of
say
the
how many
courthouse.
of them were there?
Pardon?
How many, do you remember?
There were 82 in all, there,
82.
including a few grown-ups. I know Mrs. Quinn was in there,
Mm-hmm.
a couple other women, all the older men and the full-time civil rights workers like Jesse Harris and
Mm-hmm.
Dennis Sweeney and so on were sent to Hines, and Harry Bowie was sent to Hines County Jail.
And Jesse, identify Jesse?
Jesse Harris was the
Co-po worker?
COFO leader in that, the Freedom House in
Okay.
Pike County.
All right, and Harry Bowie? Well,
Harry Bowie was an Episcopal minister from New Jersey who had come down also as a volunteer for a month and stayed for the rest of his life.
Yes, right.
I can remember his bishop calling me one day and saying, "Where's Harry?" And I said, "Well, Harry's in Hines County Jail."
Well, Harry I know because we were both members of the Delta
Ministry, yeah.
staff.
Right.
He, in fact, did stay in Pike County and stay on, right. Okay, and other kinds of activities from 65 to 68?
Well, in Mississippi, it was primarily political work.
Mhm.
That was because of the organization of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that
Okay.
the focus here and the work we did was getting, challenging the, under the new Voting Rights Act, getting Reverend Whitley on the ballot, setting aside the Sunflower County elections involving Mrs. Hamer and others. It was mainly that kind of work, and getting people out of jail
Right.
for protesting.
And representing.
In other states, in Louisiana, it was somewhat different. We did a lot of employment discrimination work in Bogalusa after the passage of the '64 Act, and some public accommodations. In Mississippi, most folks were too poor to even try to go to motels or white
To
restaurants.
integrate, right.
It was political work here.
Mhm.
In Alabama, it was a mix of these things. So it varied from place to place. But most of my own personal experience had to do with litigation under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and protecting people for exercising rights under those acts.
Okay, you were here in 1967.
I was
That was
here-
an important
I was here in
year.
'67 when we had the re-election in Sunflower County, when we had the election of Bob Clark to the Mississippi legislature. It took
Legislature.
3 lawsuits to get him seated.
Yeah, explain that.
Well, Robert Clark was a school teacher from
Holmes County.
Holmes County in the Delta, who decided to run for state legislature. And first they wouldn't let him run for office, so we filed a lawsuit under the new Voting Rights Act of '65 to get him on the ballot, and we won that case. And then he was elected in Holmes County, and they refused to credential him. And so we filed a lawsuit against the Secretary of State to force them to give him credentials to show that he was a duly elected member of the state legislature. And we won that, and we got that order, and we show up at the state capitol, and they refused to let him in the door. So we had to bring another lawsuit. And by that time, even Judge Harold Cox, who was the chief judge in the Southern District of Mississippi, and a man with a history of racist behavior in the past, had begun to change. And he gave us an order directing them to seat
The
Ron
duly
Clark,
elected
the
representative.
duly elected representative. And so it took 3 lawsuits, and he was seated, and And of course, today that has changed dramatically.
Yes, it has. Oh, any other activities of note that you recall to your memory?
Well, there were all kinds of things. I mentioned to you, I'm writing a book about my experiences in the South in those days, focusing on the courage of the local people.
Right.
There's one family in Macomb, Mrs. Quinn, a single mother, who had a cafe there. It was the only cafe that would serve the civil rights people.
Right.
So I got to know her. Her house had been bombed in September of 1964 because of civil rights activity, and for her serving meals to the civil rights workers. She had 2 kids, a 5-year-old boy and an 8-year-old daughter. By June of 1965, I'd gotten the 5-year-old Anthony Quinn out of jail 3 times already. And he was only 5 years old.
5 years old.
There's a famous picture that was in the New York Times and a Newsweek magazine and all over the country showing Anthony Quinn in June, if you may remember, the last week of June 1965, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and others called for protests to picket the state capitol because there was a special session of the legislature called to try to avoid the implications of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which was going to take effect July 2nd of 65. So in June, they're meeting to try to figure out ways to get around it. And Anthony Quinn was walking by the governor's mansion with a whole group of other people, this 5-year-old. He had an American flag in his hand, and this highway patrolman grabs the flag and tries to get it away from him, and he lifts it up, and Anthony's feet are off the ground, but he won't let go of the flag, and his 8-year-old sister, Jackie, is standing there with another trooper's arms around her, but she's still holding a sign saying, "No more police brutality." Well, that photograph was all over, and that's going to be on the cover of my book, because I own the print of that photograph.
That's good.
So, stories of people like
Now,
that.
that resulted in some jailings, as I remember.
1,100 people were arrested.
Yes.
Most of the civil rights leadership who had come in from outside the state, because I still see John Lewis, who's now a member of Congress from Georgia. Every time I see him, I introduced him to my young son once. He said, "You know, your daddy wouldn't get me out of jail once in Jackson." Because the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party said, "We won't get out of jail. No one comes out until we get a court order saying the arrests are illegal or we get some injunction."
Right.
So, but John didn't know about that. He had to get back to Atlanta. But couldn't let him out. But they had all the leadership in the Hinds County Jail, but there were 1,000 people in the fairgrounds.
In the fairgrounds.
In the city
I remember that
fairgrounds.
demonstration.
And we had to bring medical help in there. Al Poussant, I remember him running the medical committee for Human Rights Office.
Right, Harry Jackson.
And another woman nurse who was working with him, I forget her name.
Josephine Despati, I believe.
Maybe.
I think that's who it was.
And we had to get them into the fairgrounds and make sure that people in the fairgrounds were getting food, and you know, if they needed, some of them needed pills, we had to bring in pills. And that lasted for about 10 days, and then we got an order from the Fifth Circuit, the Court of Appeals, directing Judge Cox to accept one removal petition for all of them.
What did that constitute? What did that mean?
We wanted to remove those cases from the state court to the federal court.
Okay.
And then they couldn't be prosecuted in state court.
Okay.
And Judge Cox wouldn't accept
One petition.
He wanted one petition for each person.
That was being held.
And I'll never forget this. I had been over in Alabama, at my Alabama office one day during that period, and I come back about 10 o'clock at night. I pass by the office before I go to home, and I look, I see all the lights are on in the office up on the second floor. I come in there, and all the lawyers and the secretaries and the law clerks, we had students, they're all there with a mimeograph machine. We didn't have...
Making petitions.
Making all these petitions. I said, "Wait a minute, what are you doing?" So, "Well, Judge Cox won't accept this, so we're making 1,100 petitions." I said, no. So we filed one mandamus proceeding, that is a proceeding to a higher court asking them to direct him to do the right thing, and they did. When we got that order directing him to accept one removal petition for each day of the arrest, so it was about 5 days.
5 days. One writ.
One.
Yeah.
And then they all came out on he ordered them released without bond, and they all came out.
Okay. Well, and that was 65.
That was
summer
that was June,
65.
the end of June 1965. And it was, then we got an order from the Court of Appeals finding that those ordinances that they'd been arrested, parading without a permit, leaf leaving without a permit, were all unconstitutional. And in 1971, when I was back in the South, I was back in New Orleans then, practicing law with Dave Dennis and others, and training young black lawyers. I went back to Jackson and had a hearing in the Hinds County Court and got all those charges dismissed. And those that did put up bail, I got that money back and distributed it around the people that put up the bail money.
Very
So
interesting.
that went on till 1971.
Any other noteworthy cases that you can cite during your tour?
In Mississippi.
In Mississippi,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, well, one that I was a really interesting thing was happened on a Saturday night. I was having dinner at my apartment, and one of the volunteer lawyers, a guy from New York, Richard Frank, was having dinner with us, and I get a call that a whole bunch of grown-ups and kids who were marching from Edwards, Mississippi, the first march out of Edwards, Mississippi, you know where Mount Beulah was?
Yeah.
They were marching on the highway, Civil Rights March, first time ever, and they all got arrested. There were about 30 adults and 50 kids. And it's Saturday night, it's about 7:30. Now, I called up the district attorney then, it was Bill Waller, who later became governor.
Right.
And I said, Bill, we got all these folks down there, I want to get them out tonight. He said, okay, I'll meet you down at the Hinds County Courthouse. And then he said, I'll call Judge Guernsey, he's the juvenile judge, Carl Guernsey, and I'll have him come down there to process the kids. If that had been in New York City, I couldn't have gotten the DA and the judge down on Saturday night after dinner to process them.
Amazing.
But they did that in Mississippi,
Yeah.
and, and these were not, big progressive people. I mean, Bill Waller was not the worst person in the world,
Right.
but he was the local DA, and he was part of the system. So was Judge Guernsey. They came down, got some people rounded up to put up the bail, and were processing the grown-ups. In the meantime, Judge Guernsey said, okay, if those kids have their parents here, I'll release them all in my custody. So the kids are all released, and they're sitting on the floor in the Hinds County courthouse. It's now about 11 o'clock, 11:30 at night, and they're sitting there in the dark.
Oh.
Just a few little lights in,
Yeah.
and then the kids begin singing,
Oh,
and they're singing softly, "This little light of mine."
oh my.
And I'm telling you, I get the chills every time I think about that. And
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
one of the stories that I want to tell about just the bravery of the kids, but also the interesting impact of the fact that white people in a place like Jackson, even though they were racist, they had some feelings, and that they were used to being around black people more, and they, it was a different kind of segregation or racism that you had in Boston and New York,
Yes.
where there was a lot more
They were colder.
cold, there was no contact at all.
Right.
And
That's
that
very
one
interesting.
episode
Did you
really,
ever find out what inspired that march?
the Edwards March,
Yeah.
I had that in my notes. I've forgotten what it was
Oh.
about, but it was the first march ever that they'd
That
done.
they had tried to do.
Yeah.
And they were marching from Edwards
From-
to Jackson?
From Edwards to Jackson on the highway.
On the highway, on a Saturday.
The side of the highway.
What year was it?
That was in that was in the spring of '66,
Spring of '66.
early '66.
Well, isn't that
Well, that's one that stands out in my mind.
Okay, were you here during the Meredith March?
Yeah.
Tell me what role did you and your lawyers play in that?
Well, the Meredith March, as we know, it was in '67. 66, I'm sorry, in May of '66, when
Yeah, exactly.
James Meredith started out up above on the border just below Memphis,
Right.
and the
Minnesota
northern part of the
County.
state. Gets shot on the first day or the second day,
Exactly.
and gets wounded in the legs. And at that point, all the leadership of the civil rights organizations came in to
Conversion
continue continue the march. Dr. King,
We had a series of meetings in Memphis to continue that.
yeah, Dr. King was there, and Stokely was there for SNCC, and
Floyd McKissick from the Corps.
Floyd McKissick from North Carolina, then the National Director of Corps.
I was there.
Giat was there.
Representing FDP here in the state.
And the march continued, and my lawyers monitored the march, so that, for example, you remember in Greenwood, Stokely, after he made the Black Power speech,
He and Willie Riggs.
they sort of set up tents or something on the courthouse lawn. They got arrested.
Yeah.
And I happened to have a lawyer. Mac Farmer was up in the next town, and he called in. And I said, "Look, we got some arrests in Greenwood. Why don't you go? Stokely and Willie Ricks and the others are in jail. Go and arrange to get them out."
Right.
And this Mac Farmer was a youngster from Providence, Rhode Island. Good lawyer, but fairly new. He was only a lawyer for about 2 or 3 years. He said, "Well, he just made that. He won't talk to me. Well, he just made that speech about only working with black people."
Yeah.
I said, "You go there and tell him you're the lawyer. See what happens."
Yeah.
So Mac Farmer describes, he walks in there sort of hesitantly and tells the sheriff, "I'm here to see Mr. Carmichael and these others." And so the sheriff says, "Hey, Carmichael, the lawyer's here." And Stokes says, "Hey, brother, the lawyer's here. All right, man, the lawyer's here." And they all hug him.
Yeah, right.
And then the next thing that happened on the march,
Canton, in the gas.
Canton.
You remember that?
Yeah, and then there's a meeting in Canton, and I came to the meeting because at that point, there was a decision it was the next day or the 2 days from then was going to be June 21, the anniversary of the killings of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman.
We went to Neshoba
And
County.
we wanted to go to Neshoba County, but the Sheriff Rainey, who was still the sheriff there, said, "You ain't coming to Neshoba County. I'm not going to let you come in. If you do, you're going to get arrested. And I can't protect you either." And so we decided to go into court and try to get an injunction.
Right.
And it was going to be, then the plaintiffs were going to be, you may have been one of them. I know Giat was one, and Floyd was one, and Dr. King was one. And I had to get everyone's signature, but I couldn't find Dr. King. I finally found Andy Young, and he and Dr. King were in a motel in North Jackson. I said, "Okay, I got to get Dr. King's signature on
Right
this."
out here in 55.
Yeah, got to get his signature on this. I said, "Okay, come on, he's up." This is about 11 o'clock at night. So I called Mrs. Stevens, the owner of Stevens Kitchen, Sarah Stevens, who was the only notary public in Jackson who would notarize our papers. And she notarized them regularly without charging us. But she was asleep already. I said, "Mrs. Stevens, I'm afraid I have to wake you up. I need your help badly tonight. I want you to notarize. I have to take you over to the motel to notarize Dr. King's signature." She said, "Dr. Martin Luther King?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I'll be ready. Pick me up in a half hour." I go to pick her up. It's now 11:30, and there she is with her best friend, dressed in their Sunday going to church clothes.
No.
Because they were going to go see Dr. King.
Oh, my God.
And I drove them over to the motel, and Andy brought them in, and Dr. King was in his undershirt with pants on. He was dictating to his secretary, and he greeted them and said hello and everything. And they were just, those two women were just so enthralled, and it was worth $1,000 to them to see and meet Dr. King and notarize his signature. We went into court the next morning and got an order to the Highway Patrol directing them to protect the marches, and so they could go to Philadelphia and have a little service there on the 21st.
At the courthouse.
But so that was a really interesting episode with Mrs. Stevens and things. And that was the last time I saw Dr. King, and I remember coming out. Dr. King's room was in the back of the motel. There was a parking area and then some bushes and shrubs there. It was dark. And I said to Andy Young, who was a good friend of mine, I knew him both in St. Augustine too, earlier in the movement. And I said, "Isn't it dangerous back here, back in the motel? There could be a sniper in the woods." And he said, "Well, there's a car full of FBI agents down there, but we can't hide all the time." And of course, 2 years later, less than 2 years later, he gets shot in the back of a motel, and that was the last time I saw him. And so it always sort of remains with me, that moment. There are hundreds of stories like this.
Oh, you got time. Give us another.
I'm going through the chapters in my book now. So, but some of them I see are not in Mississippi, so we want to keep it to Mississippi. Well, Jenny Willis, Mrs. Lily Willis's daughter being shot was a very moving thing. Mrs. Lily Willis was an active local black woman in one of the lower Delta towns. I forget which one. It's not. I think it's around Sharkey, Issaquah, somewhere around there.
Okay.
Very active with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and she. It was Thanksgiving evening, and she'd gone out with her boyfriend. She was a widow, and she had this 12-year-old daughter, Jenny. And she and Will, her boyfriend, come back because they're going to take Jenny for dinner. And they pull up in front of the house, and they start out of the car, and Jenny comes out, the kid comes out the front door to greet her mom, and Will, who she knew now. And a car pulls up, and shotgun, bam, shoots from Mrs. Willis, misses her, but hits the kid in the face. And destroys one of her eyes. And they called me about it because I knew Mrs. Willis, and we couldn't find out who did it. There was somebody up there. But I got really involved personally because Jenny was the same age as my oldest daughter. Oh. I had 3 girls who were upstate, who were in New York, and I used to go up every 3 months and visit with them. And she was the same age as Lisa, my oldest daughter. And so I really got very involved personally, and they were going to some clinic there, and the doctors didn't know what they were doing, and she just, kid's face was all scarred up, and they were just going to leave an empty socket in her eye, and so I did a letter to all the volunteer lawyers who would come down for LCDs, because this was now 1966, so we had maybe 150 lawyers. I sent letters to all of them. I sent letters to other people I knew up north, and told them the story of what happened to this kid on Thanksgiving evening, and how it was like one of my own daughters, and I asked them, could they help? And I got the most beautiful collection of letters from as far away as Alaska. People heard about it, so somebody in New York told somebody in Chicago who told somebody in Alaska, and I got $25 here, and raised about $12,000.
Wow.
And we found this surgeon, through Pat Darien. Do you remember Pat Darien?
I remember Pat.
Who was a white woman here who then went to Washington and became Assistant Secretary of State. She
was a loyalist. She was in the delegation to Chicago in '68.
Yeah. She then hooked us up with this surgeon who undertook to treat Jenny and gave her a false eye, but it looked like a real eye, and did a lot of plastic surgery on her face, and really fixed her up nicely, and charged very little, so there was money left over, which I gave Mrs. Willis. And then, so I had this book of letters that I collected, all the people who wrote about it, plus a thank you and a poem that Jenny Willis wrote for me after it was all over. So that was it was a different kind of experience, but one that I remember very well. Then there was Maggie Gordon. Do you remember Maggie Gordon? It was a woman in Holmes County, I believe, the local woman who was being harassed for trying to register to vote, and then she finally does register, or tries to register, and some highway patrolman grabs her and beats her up. Not as badly as Mrs. Hamer got beaten up, but pretty badly. And we decided it was time to try something. We sued the highway patrol and this individual officer for damages in federal court. And the week before the trial, they came and settled it for $1,500. Well, $1,500 then would be like $150,000 today. It hit the New York Times, it hit all the papers, and it changed the behavior of the highway patrol. And they realized that they could become vulnerable because they made the trooper pay part of it himself.
Where was that suit heard?
In the Northern District for Judge Clayton.
Oh.
But it was settled before the trial. They settled it.
They settled it before the trial?
$1,500.
Oh.
And we didn't take any fee. We just gave her the whole $1,500. But it made a change in the behavior of the highway patrol after that.
Very interesting.
And that was an important case for this woman.
Were you involved in the suit against the state to integrate the Highway Patrol by any chance? Dave?
No.
No?
No, we did bring a suit to integrate the federal court juries.
Explain that.
Well,
What was that
they
about?
jurors were being taken from the voting rolls, and a lot of counties, we had a lot of black people, there were no registered black voters. I mean,
Mhm.
at that time in Amite County, Liberty, there was one black registered voter, Mr. Steptoe.
Yeah.
And you remember what happened to Herbert Lee when he tried to register to vote?
Right.
He was killed
Yeah.
on the steps of the county courthouse by a member of the state legislature.
Yeah, I remember
And
that.
the one witness who saw what happened, he was killed 2 years later,
Mhm.
probably by the sheriff,
Mm.
Sheriff Daniel Jones.
Mm.
Never forget that man.
Were you involved in that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
explain that.
later on. Well,
Okay.
I did a lot of work in Amite County because Mr. Steptoe, who's a very active leader there,
Mhm.
and who was somewhat independent because he owned his own land and he owned his
Yes.
own farm and he had a bunch of kids.
Yeah,
So he had his own little army.
okay.
And they're very brave people. He was the only black registered voter in the county. In 1961, before I got there, but this was another man, Herbert Lee, wanted to go down and register to vote at the county courthouse, which is called Liberty. Liberty is the county seat.
Mhm.
Mr. Steptoe used to say, there's a town in Mississippi called Liberty and a department in Washington called Justice, and there ain't a bit of difference between them. But anyway, Herbert Lee was killed on a shot on the steps of the courthouse
Good.
by a sitting member of the state legislature.
Mhm.
And a dozen white men all came into court and testified, that Herbert Lee had a knife and he was going to attack this man and so on. And one person, whose name was Allen, I believe, Lewis Allen, I think it was Lewis Allen,
Mm.
came in and said, no, that's not what happened. He
Yeah.
said,
I think
that man shot him in the back. He didn't have any knife.
Mhm.
And he began to be harassed. He had a small house outside of Liberty, and he decided to move. His family was going to move to Chicago, and the night before they moved, he got called out, said, Sheriff Jones wants to see you, and he never came back. And they found his body in the fields the next morning.
Mm.
And no one ever knew who killed him, but I believe the sheriff
Mm.
killed him.
Certainly.
But then I had a case there. It's also the county where Bob Moses got beat up, who was one of the original SNCC people down here. He had tried to press charges for getting beaten up by some people down by the courthouse. He was trying to accompany some people to register to vote, and they beat him up. He filed charges, and when he showed up for the trial in '63, there were 100 white men sitting in the courtroom with guns. With guns.
Mhm.
And the sheriff wouldn't do anything about it. And so he was convicted, his case was thrown out. In 1965, we had another case involving a black man who had been beaten up by two others, and we went to court. But I told Mr. Steptoe what happened to Bob Moses, so 50 black men showed up with me, and we marched into the court.
Mhm.
They didn't have guns showing, but I think they all had it. And walked in, and and there had been about 50 white men in there too, but one by one they got up and left. And we got this trial, and I got a conviction for the people who beat this man up.
Mhm.
And then the last episode I had there was a young African-American man by the name of L.C. Tobias. I don't know whether you remember this case, in 1966 now. Tobias was a black man with a very good-looking young man in his 20s, but a little, not all his marbles together.
Mhm.
And he was having an affair with a white woman, the wife of a farmer there.
Mm.
They were having a sexual affair. And one day they're in bed together, and the woman's two kids come in. They came home from school early. I think they were 8 and 9 years old. They see their mother in bed with a black man. So she panicked and she yelled rape.
Mm.
And she went and told her husband and the police that he raped her, and they arrested him and charged him with rape. And I come down there. First of all, I got him out of the local jail because I was afraid he'd be lynched, you know,
Right.
like Mac Charles Parker. So we got him to Hinds County, and then when we went back, got the state police to escort us back, me and another lawyer. And as we come into the courthouse in Liberty County seat, as you go up the stairway, there's sort of an open skylight at the top of the stairway. And the same Sheriff Jones, he meets us at halfway up and says, "Hey, you're the lawyers for that rape guy, huh?" I said, "Yes, we're the lawyers for that defendant." He says, "See that? That's where we hang niggas, right there." You know. So he was letting me know. But what we were able to do, there was a very interesting doctor who was the head of the state mental hospital at Whitfield, who I had met on another occasion, and I called him in to examine Tobias to find out if he was mentally competent to stand trial. And the doctor that met with me said, "Well, he is. He's he's not the brightest guy in the world, but so I think he knows what's going on. But he's a little shaky." I said, "Well, if we go with this trial, they're going to kill him." He said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay." So he goes in and testifies that he's not competent to stand trial. He doesn't understand what the nature of the thing. And so they are forced, and they had no doctor on the other side, so they send him to Whitfield, to the state hospital, to be confined until he either is competent to stand trial or off for the rest of his life. And 2 years later, and we keep following what's going on, and we find out, Steptoe told us, or one of the sons, that the woman has left and gone to Chicago. So we go back to the doctor, and he comes in, we bring him into court, and he said, "Well, he's made some great recovery, and he understands what's going on now." And I say, "We're ready for trial." And they have no witness. And we knew she wasn't going to come back and face this.
Exactly.
So they threw out the charges, and we got him out. And we saved his life.
Absolutely.
He hadn't done anything except be a little foolish. So that's all in that one county, Amite County.
Amite County.
Yeah.
And you left Mississippi in 1968?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to the Kennedy School at Harvard, what I call the rest cure.
A rest cure. R&R.
But then, and I was going to start working on my book then, and I had an advanced in Doubleday, and then Dr. King was killed, and I got a call from the General Counsel of Corps that there had been some rioting the night of his murder in Tallahassee, Florida, in the black section of town where there were some white businesses, groceries and so on, that had been torched by angry young, and that happened in a number of cities around the country. And in this one grocery, unfortunately, there was a 18-year-old asleep in the back of the store, and he was overcome with the smoke and died. And they arrested 6 kids and charged them with arson, murder, capital offense. They released 4, including the ones who had actually done it, and they kept these 2 youngest ones, who were 16 and 17. And the 16-year-old was not all together. And they kept him in jail for 5 days and wouldn't let him see his parents. They wouldn't let him see a lawyer, and they just kept interrogating him. And he hadn't. And they weren't there because I tracked down the guys who had done it. And they said Billy Ray and James weren't there, and they had left the state by then. These other guys, and they were going to prosecute Billy Ray, Oliver, and James Colbert, and this kid finally confesses, the younger one. But the confession bore no resemblance to the known facts because he wasn't there. He just said, he just wanted to be fed. He wanted to see his mama, and so he said whatever they wanted. So they kept giving him more information. He confessed 5 times. Each confession getting more closer to the reality. And the 5th one, they figured, well, that's good enough. They printed verbatim on the front page of the Tallahassee Democrat, the major newspaper in the area from which the jury was going to be selected. Printed the whole thing. So the Corps asked me to go down there. The only lawyer around was this young fellow named Reese Marshall, who had never tried a felony case, let alone a capital case. He was going to be the lawyer. nice fellow, but he knew he was over his head. So they asked me, and I went down there and did the trial with Reese, and challenged first I moved for change of venue, and the judge wouldn't, on the basis of this confession, the payment wouldn't give it to me. So I knew I had pretty good grounds then. And I really went after the lieutenant who had gotten the confession. And in any event, the jury convicted both of them, but didn't give them, not a capital offense, they gave them life. So that was a partial victory because they really wanted to kill these kids. And I appealed to the Florida Supreme Court and got them reversed in the Florida Supreme Court on the grounds that they prejudicial pretrial publicity, the printing of the confession. And they threw out the confessions as well. So they had nothing, and the kids were turned loose. Followed James, the younger one, got into trouble again, some robberies. The older one, Colbert, called me about 7 or 8 years ago. He was writing a little book of his own about what happened, and he was now working with kids with juveniles who got into trouble. He left Florida, though. He moved to Georgia. He didn't want to stay in Florida. So that was an interesting case there.
Tell us what circumstances brought about the organization of the National Prison Project?
The Attica uprising in September of '71, when Attica blew up and all those people were killed when the governor sent in the state troopers.
Yeah, I remember that.
And at that time, the ACLU had 2 small projects. They had a little one in Buffalo, run by the New York Civil Liberties Union, basically servicing Attica prisoners, and they had one in Virginia, run by the Virginia ACLU, basically servicing the penitentiary in Richmond. And after Attica happened, and there was a lot of publicity after the Attica Commission came out with their report, and there was a film about it, a video, some of the funders said, you ought to coordinate this stuff and do something more thorough. And I was back in New Orleans at the time, and the then director of the ACLU, R.A.N.I., who was now the president of the Soros Foundation, he called me and said, come up and talk to us about, we want to do something more extensive in prisons, and that was the birth of the Prison Project in spring of '72. It really came out of Attica. And I thought, 5, 8 years we'd fix that, and it's still going on now.
5, 8 years.
But I stayed 20,
How long was that?
Till '96.
From when to when?
72 to '96,
72.
24 years,
Wow,
almost 25 years. But it's still going on. They have 9 lawyers there in the office now. I'm sort of,
Did you have any involvement with Parchment during your period with the National Prison Project?
No, but they have now. They do.
They do.
They did the AIDS case there, and they have a case now, depending on conditions, in the maximum security unit there. I mean, Parchment is a weird situation. There is a lawyer in town.
Oh yeah, I remember since Gates.
Since Gates, Ron Welch, who is still the lawyer for the prisoners in the Parchment case, and he has a retainer.
Explain what Gates and Collier.
Well, that was what we call a totality case. Gates versus Collier was a
comprehensive suit.
Comprehensive suit involving prison conditions, lack of medical care, brutality. Was filed in the early '70s. It was one of a number filed in the Deep South. I handled one in Alabama. We had one in Arkansas, one here. This was handled by the Lawyers Committee, what we call the President's Committee, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Law.
Oh yeah.
They handled the Gates case. And the last lawyer for them, who then went into private practice, was this lawyer by the name of Ron Welch, who is still here. But it's very strange. He now is paid an annual fee by the Department of Corrections, by the state, a huge fee to monitor things, but he doesn't do anything as far as we can tell. Because when we got letters complaining about the treatment of the AIDS prisoners, they said he wouldn't answer their letters. And we went into court on that, and the state brought him in to oppose us going in. And the Fifth Circuit said, no, they have a legitimate, prisoners can say we want a new lawyer. And so the Prison Project is now doing some other cases in Parchment. And I don't know what Ron Welch does.
Is he still employed by the state?
Yeah,
Wow, really amazing.
yeah. I was somebody at the Jackson Clarion Ledger during the time we were challenging his ability to keep us out.
Mhm.
Some reporter at the Clarion Ledger said, how do you explain Ron Welch? And I said, well, I think he's been out in the sun too long. And he said,
That's been a long time.
yeah,
Yeah, 50 years.
yeah. So,
On top of that.
the prison project is still doing a lot of stuff. It's harder now to litigate those cases because of some legislation that Congress passed in 1996,
Mhm.
making it tougher to sort of limiting the jurisdiction of federal courts to intervene on prison cases. So they can't bring totality cases anymore. They have to be narrow as one or two issues, but they're still doing a lot of important litigation.
Did Cummings and Angola have similar situations as it related to lawsuits being brought against those states?
Yeah, Cummins had a case called Hope v. Sarver, and Angola had one, the name which I forget. And we got in Angola for a while and helped out on that case. It was
With the prison project?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
It had been brought by some private lawyers and the Department of Justice, and they both then gave it up. I mean, after they won the case, they didn't monitor what was going on.
mhm.
And things, if you don't monitor them, they slip back
Sure.
quickly.
Mhm.
So we've done some work at Angola since then. Cummins is, there's nothing going on there now. That changed. They had a couple of good, decent directors come in and change things around.
Corrections.
Corrections directors, yeah. Yeah, Alabama, we did a major case. It was the first one where we got the federal court, and that was Frank Johnson, who was a very good judge on
The
civil
judge,
rights,
yeah, I
and
remember him.
he's the one who ordered the summer march
Yeah,
to proceed.
right.
He found, we came up with a theory that he could look at the totality of conditions in a if you looked at the totality of conditions in a prison, even things that might not necessarily by themselves be covered by the Constitution, but in totality, they actually made people worse. Made people less able to function when they got out of prison than when they went in, but that had to be a violation of the Eighth Amendment, the cruel and unusual punishment clause.
Mhm.
And we proved that, and he made that finding in Alabama,
Mm.
that conditions actually made them worse, and therefore he could order everything, including how many fresh toothbrushes they get a year,
Mm.
visiting issues, medical, hiring of African-American staff in a prison population that was 70% black and only 2 black officers in the whole system.
Mm.
So he really went into everything under this totality theory, and it made a big difference. And then we replicated that in, we wanted to show that it wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. We went to Rhode Island next
Oh, really?
and won the same kind of thing there, and then Tennessee, then Colorado, and by 1957, we had 28 states under court order. The prison project alone,
By 1987.
87. We had 28 states in
28.
which the entire
Under
state
court
prison system, or one or more major institutions, were under a court order.
Interesting. Mm. Mm. All right.
So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. What's that? Well, so it's 4:00. You want to keep on going, or do you want to?
Why don't we take a break now? Let's see if Nishambi is
Is
here.
Nishambi
I'd
here?
like to maybe spend a few minutes with her and see if you have any ideas of,
Okay. As you go to the rear of that camera, will you just press that red button?
press the red button, it won't bite me.
Okay, now look at the, does it say standby, STBY,
On the screen?
on the screen?
No, it's,
In the right corner of the screen, in a little red marking?
it says REC.
Okay, then you haven't pressed